Good afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Lewis with the Eno Center for Transportation. Thank you for tuning into the webinar this afternoon, where we will be talking through Eno's newest paper, Refreshing the Status Quo, a look at federal highway programs and funding distribution. I have with me Jeff Davis, who helped co-author the paper. Unfortunately, Alice Grossman, who was also a co-author on the report, was unable to make it to the webinar today, but Jeff and I are going to spend the next few minutes going through the paper. We will talk through our methodology, the results, some of our findings, some of the impetus for this paper, and then we will conclude the webinar with some time for question answer. The Q&A portion of this will be done through the chat function of the webinar. So the chat function will be, it's on your, or I guess it's a questions function. So you'll be able to look at the question function of your GoToWebinar panel and ask questions that way. And you can start asking questions during the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can following our presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. And Jeff is going to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Paul. In the fiscal year that just ended a couple of days ago, Federal Highway Administration gave a little over $45 billion in what's called formula-based highway aid to states. 42.4 was from the Highway Trust Fund, and the other 2.7 billion was from the general revenues that were added by the appropriations committees. I started thinking about this a year ago when some people started asking me, what would happen if the census undercounts our state? What will happen to our highway funding? And after I thought about it, I realized absolutely nothing will happen to you if the census undercounts your state. Because the formula by which we're giving away this money through fiscal 2020 is based entirely on the political deals and the earmarks that were made in 2005 in the SAFETEA law, and some real-world factors like VMT, population, bridge conditions, and air quality as of 2007, and how much gasoline and diesel fuel is purchased in Texas each year. Nothing that has happened in the real world outside of Texas has any bearing on highway funding distribution today. So we thought at the Eno Center we should look at why this happened and ask if there's ways we can do better. Going back in time, in the beginning, there were real-world highway formula factors. Starting in 1916, the first Highway Act, there was an original formula that was 1/3 state population for the big states, 1/3 land area for the western states, and 1/3 postal route miles as the compelling federal interest. In 1944, they added some new formulas for rural secondary roads, and then a population-based formula for urban roads. Then in 1956, you had the Interstate Act, which gave out interstate money separately, based solely on each state's estimated cost to complete building the roads that were listed on that were drawn on that map in 1956. And starting in the 1970s, there were new formulas and programs added for bridges, which were also cost to upgrade, much like the interstate. And everything else, there were different kind of roads by system, lane miles, VMT, fuel use. There were safety programs that had lane miles and fatality rates as factors. There was the air quality program that was based on how many people in each state lived in Clean Air Act non-attainment areas. And these factors were all updated every year using real-world numbers by the Federal Highway Administration for giving out funding. Next slide. But also, as the interstate started winding down, you started to have fights between states as to what their fair share was. So you started to have these so-called equity programs that came along and added money to the program. In 1982, you had the 85% minimum rate of return for the donor states. In 1991, ICE-T, that got raised to 90%. Plus, there was a separate $3 billion one-time donor state bonus. Plus, they started guaranteeing every state, especially donee states, minimum total shares of the program. In 1998, T21 swept all those different programs into one minimum guarantee for both the donor and the donee states. And then in 2005, that was renamed Equity Bonus, that finally raised the rate of return to 92% and then guaranteed every state either their gas tax minimum rate of return or a fixed share. Now, you can see here on this graph that these equity adjustments replaced interstate construction spending. The green line, starting from left, is the percentage of total formula money that was given out for interstate construction. You can see it declines to zero starting in 1996. And replacing it, you had these equity adjustments. And by the end of SAFETEA, equity bonus was a little over 25% of the whole program. And that just shows the formula money. The other thing that replaced interstate construction as a binding agent to hold states together were earmarks. And those were another 11% of the total FHWA budget by the end of SAFETEA in 2009. That would be on top of that blue line. So 2009 was the last year where there were factor-based formulas. $26.2 billion, 65% of the total money given to states was factor-based formulas. Another $9.6 billion was equity bonus, and $4.5 billion of earmarks. And we would publish an article explaining this further on the Eno Center website. If you click on the highway and street mode button, it'll be the first article you see. Under the FAST Act, through the apportionments that were given out yesterday to states, each state is guaranteed a percentage of total annual highway funding equal to what they got in 2009 plus all the earmarks, as adjusted by Texas's 95% gas tax adjustment in 2014, and then as adjusted by any subsequent gas tax adjustment, which so far only Texas has been able to trigger up until yesterday. And again, Texas was, in the new apportionments yesterday, the only state to trigger the 95% gas tax adjustment. So they got an extra $208.4 million that came out of every other state pro rata. Nothing else matters. It doesn't matter if everybody moved out of your state, you're still going to get the same amount of money. This is particularly galling on the CMAQ program because the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 and the ICE-T of 91 that created CMAQ were a matched set of laws written by Patrick Moynihan that were all about trying to direct money to the cities that had the most people living in the worst air quality. Some cities might have really upgraded their air quality since 2007, but to the government it doesn't matter. They're going to get the same. The CMAQ money is still based on the people living in non-contaminated areas in 2007. Similarly, some states might have let some of their roads go back to gravel. Some might have really worked hard to upgrade the roads. Doesn't matter. Everything's still for the calendar year 2007 factors that were used in the 2009 apportionments, plus all those earmarks that everybody got in 2005, especially the $750 million for Bakersfield, California, for Bill Thomas. California is still reaping the rewards of that money built into their formulas, etc., and nothing else matters. So as a way to try to figure out if there were other better ways to potentially distribute some of this $45 billion a year in highway funding. I should also mention the 2012 MAP 21 law created a new series of national highway system goals and performance measures: safety, asset condition, congestion reduction, freight movement, system reliability, environmental sustainability. Every state now has to measure its progress and performance in these metrics against certain targets. The law even said that this was supposed to, quote, transform the federal aid highway program and provide a means to the most efficient investment of federal transportation funds by focusing on national transportation goals, increasing the accountability and transparency of the program, and improving project decision-making through performance-based planning and programming, unquote. We're now collecting all this great data, and states are measuring their performance, and it makes no difference whatsoever in the way that the federal government is distributing funding to states under the FAST Act. The MAP 21 goals have zero connection to federal funding distribution. Changes in real-world population, VMT, road bridge conditions, air quality, safety, etc., since 2007 have zero connection to federal highway funding distribution. Nothing that's happened in the real world since 2007 except Texans buying gasoline and diesel matters. Can we do better?
So thanks, Jeff. So what we did is we decided to design and test a couple alternative scenarios for distributing federal funds. As part of that process in the paper, starting on page 12, you'll see that we reviewed several federal and state programs like Transit New Start, the Urban Area Formula Grant, along with a few other federal programs like No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, distribute funding to states, and also some non-federal programs like the Colorado DOT, the Florida DOT, Kansas DOT, that distributes funding in those states to their localities for transportation. So we reviewed those and drew some lessons from how they distribute funding, and then created some scenarios. Now, this only evaluates the formula funds of the Highway Trust Fund highway account. So we did not look at the transit programs. We did not look at the discretionary programs. We really just had to keep ourselves somewhat bounded and look at the highway account. We use the 2018 programs and distribution of $41.4 billion as a baseline to gauge how states do relative to each other as the funding distribution changed. We do calculate minimum apportionments, maximum changes that we'll talk about. And then we have the 8 scenarios. The first one is a reprise of the original 1916 highway apportionment. The next 5 employ the current FAST programs using different methods for distributing funds. The 7th introduces a few new program goals. And then the final 8th scenario tests new highway programs altogether, and we'll talk through those. So I want to make it clear that this is certainly not exhaustive. It is obviously siloed just in the highway mode for this report. It's not intended to create a recommendation or have a recommended scenario. It's more just to start this conversation of saying, look, if we do want to bring formulas back into this, what does it mean for states? How can we start designing these formulas in a way that gets at the goals and the outcomes we want from our federal program? So the first scenario was the 1916 one, and I'm actually going to turn it back to Jeff to explain this one because he is the in-house historian, and we did this one upon his request.
Yeah, this is my idea. It's kind of a lark. We just had the 100th anniversary of the highway program. How would the original way in which they decided to distribute funding compare to today? 1/3 state population as a factor, that's pretty simple. The original act had 1/3 postal route miles. That's not a particularly good metric as the federal interest these days, so I switched that over to NHS lane miles to reflect the evolution of the compelling federal interest. And then 1/3 state land area. And the big difference in the land area of states between 1916 and today is, of course, Alaska. Alaska was actually allowed into the highway program as a state a year before statehood in 1958. And there was a special rule in the formula just for Alaska that said only 1/3 of their land area counts towards the 1/3 factor for the formula. So we use the 1958 original Alaska rule and NHS lane miles of 1/3 state population. And also we didn't use, because this is just a lark, we didn't use any cap on percentage change versus current apportionments when we ran this. And you can see here, obviously the big square states out west and Alaska gain the most. Texas loses more than you might think because so much of Texas's money today comes from their gas tax rate of return rather than other things. And then, just as you can see, California loses some, not as much as you might think, and it's the high population states of the Northeast that lose out the most.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to walk through the remaining 7 scenarios and some of the things we learned from each one. So scenario 2, we applied the SAFETEA formulas from 2009 back onto today's programs. We don't do any donor-donee equity adjustments. We don't account for any of the proportional share for earmarks. We have state minimum apportionments of 0.5%, and then to limit volatility, we do limit the apportionments. They can't increase or decrease by more than 10% over the prior year. And so the results on the next slide here show that a lot of the states in the middle of the country went out. Texas and California, although they're not the darkest of blue, California receives an extra $239 million. Texas, that was California. Texas increases $189 million. But states like Pennsylvania, Illinois, New York all lose a significant amount of money. The formula factors that were in SAFETEA relied a lot on lane miles and a lot on vehicle mile travel in each state. And so that goes to benefit a lot of states that have a lot of lane miles, obviously, and a lot of driving. And so that tends to be a lot of the states in the middle part of the country and the Great Plains where those factors play out.
I should add that the full report has complete dollar amounts and percentage changes for every program, for every state, for every scenario.
Yes. So those, and I should also mention too, for those following along, on ENO's website, you can download the raw data that we use to create each one of these scenarios, and you can tinker with and create your own scenario and see how it all worked out. The most complete data is, again, available for free download on ENO's website. So in scenario 3, we decided to throw out the old formulas, and we looked at a couple new ways of distributing money based solely on needs. So if you have lots of roads, lots of population, lots of freight, you obviously have lots of needs for maintenance and new transportation infrastructure. So we devised a whole scenario based on those needs, including lane miles, ton miles of freight, number of structurally deficient bridges, pavement condition, job accessibility, fatalities. Depending on the program, tying it somewhat to the goal of each program, we put some need-based factors. So the results of scenario 3 shows a little bit different than the first one. These factors tended to benefit those states with greater lane miles per capita and more miles traveled per capita. But interestingly, some of the states that you would expect to have a lot of increase in funding didn't do so well. Texas, for example, has a relatively low amount of structurally deficient bridges. So because they've done well in deficient bridges, they receive significantly less funding. Same goes for Florida, where they have relatively good pavement condition on their roadways. They get punished, if you want to call it that, by receiving less funding. The states in the Northeast, for example, do pretty well because they have lots of structurally deficient bridges and poor pavement. And so on a needs base, they get a lot more funding. So that leads us to scenario 4. We said, well, what if we flip it on its head and we say, well, let's keep the FAST Act program structure, but let's do everything based on incentives. So for the CMAQ program, we put an improvement on a roadway congestion index. For the safety program, we have decreases in fatalities. Year over year, I guess for the NHPP, decreases in structurally deficient bridges. The Surface Transportation Block Program, improvement on job access and decrease in single occupancy vehicle use. So a lot of performance-based metrics, again, with a lot of the no donor-donee equity adjustments, volatility limits, and minimum apportionments. When we ran that scenario, we got a very different outcome. This one has no consistent pattern because it's all based on the most recent data available and how each state performed. A state that increased fatalities basically gets zero money in that program. The states that had decreased it in the prior year get pretty significant. For example, if you look at Minnesota and Maine and New Hampshire, they all did very well, not because they have any kind of inherent structural thing in terms of the formula factors, other than in the years that we had data, they performed really well in improving their outcomes. So it goes to show that this type of distribution could be highly volatile, but it also provides a tremendous amount of incentive for states to find ways to reduce or I guess improve on their performance metrics, because that's how the funding would be distributed in this case. So scenario 5, we tried to add a little balance to the program, and for each of the FAST Act programs, we put a mix of both needs-based factors and also included some performance-based factors. Usually it was about 70% needs-based or 50% needs-based, and then 30% to 50% performance-based. And these had similar results to 3 and 4, and we can move on to the next slide. When we looked at the results, a little bit more of a pattern we see in the middle of the country, just like we did in scenario 3. A lot of those states doing well from the needs-based factors, but some of the performance-based factors have a pretty large sway. One of the things that we tested in this formula as well is using per capita measures. So in the safety program, 50% of the money went out based on needs. So we just used the number of fatality on roadways. But we also had 50% of the money going out on improvement in fatalities per capita. We originally had just improvement in fatalities, raw numbers, but that made it very difficult for some of the states with lower populations to compete. So we thought the per capita basis provided a little bit more of an equal playing field for states around the country. Okay, so scenario 6 is the exact same apportionment as scenario 3, except that we introduce a new set aside for a bonus pot. So this would be a relatively small but significant, an $828 million bonus pot that DOT could reward back to states for meeting certain performance goals. So states are starting to report goals from MAP 21 and the FAST Act, and now they might be able to be rewarded, and perhaps the Secretary would distribute that $828 million based on the performance of the prior year. We didn't really specify how that would be, but when we look at the results, we see a pretty similar result to what we had in scenario 3, which is expected, except that it's more states lose out because there is that 2% set aside. When we sent this paper to review to ENO's Board of Advisors, a few folks had commented saying that perhaps 2% is too small and not enough funding overall to really incentivize states to improve their performance. So we hope that this is really a conversation starter on a set aside for a performance-based allocation pool. So scenario 7 is where we talk a little bit about the national goals. We modified the current FAST Act programs to base them around some performance goals, to be a little bit more specific than we had originally. And we assigned some performance measures that we use to distribute money. And part of this was based on what we thought was a good measure, and part of it was based on the fact that we can only use measures that actually existed. So we were a little bit limited into what we had in terms of data. So again, this uses both performance-based and need-based factors. We kept the bonus pot as a conversation piece and kind of as both having a bonus pot and the performance-based factors as part of this. We thought could incentivize more better performance. And then again, we limited volatility and we had state minimum apportionments. So this one, there's an awful lot of red. Part of that is because we did peel away some of we had the 2% set aside. There's a lot of volatility introduced because we have some of the performance-based being either 30 or 50% of each program. And a select number of the big population states like California and Texas continue to lose money relative to some of the smaller population states, yet again demonstrating the effectiveness of certain factors such as lane miles or VMT, as that goes to generally benefit some of the smaller population states. The other thing that this highlighted to us was that we really need some better metrics, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but things like the job accessibility metric that we use and the travel time index are less than ideal for many reasons, and they are not a great way of measuring access and efficiency, and we really need to have some of those data points enhanced if we really are going to achieve the goals set out in the federal programs. Okay, so the last scenario, we wanted to have a little fun and put in a little imagination into what a new program structure would look like. So this is one where, drawing in part on the TRB's Future of the Interstate report that was released earlier this year, we created a highway maintenance improvement program, really combining the NHPP and the STB block grants to get more than 2/3 of the total funding focused on maintenance, going out formula base as a guaranteed base level funding for states on a need base. We have an environmental impact program which replaces CMAQ, including goals for greenhouse gas reduction, again formula based, but has some performance component to it. Metropolitan planning program is basically the same as the current, and then we have a couple discretionary grant programs that we peeled off the top. So we have a freight improvement program. This is a discretionary grant program, would be similar to New Starts or the build programs at $3 billion a year. Metropolitan Access Program, another discretionary program focused on transformational investments for regional accessibility, and then a technology pool for transportation technology advancements. So when we ran the scenario for this one, we did use needs-based factors for the maintenance program, while a blend of needs-based and performance factors for the other programs. 2% of each program is reserved for the bonus pot, and we had to expand the volatility percentage to 25% because there was so much change. Of course, because we peeled off some discretionary grant funds, and those don't go out through traditional formulas, most states end up losing money, although they could win it back by being competitive in the discretionary grant programs. A few of the big block states, Mississippi and New Hampshire included, increase some of their funding, which was a little surprising to us, but they seem to score really well on some of the metrics that we have. But it really shows that the maintenance program, which is of 2/3, a total of $34 billion, has an outsized effect on the overall distribution. And it might be worth considering splitting up that program or something in the future to provide a little bit of consistency and balance to the outcomes. So some concluding thoughts, and remember that those 8 scenarios are not, we don't recommend that we go with any one of them, but they're supposed to start this conversation and start testing out what a funding program distribution might look like if we are to revisit the formula factors. Now, of course, this provides some big challenges. And the first big challenge is that we need better data. Right now, the Federal Highway Program and highway statistics is not as current as it used to be, in part because those factors are not used to distribute billions and billions of dollars. There's also a lot of factors that are missing, and a lot to be wanted that the federal government can and should be collecting from states, making public, keeping relevant, so that it can be part of the discussion of funding distribution. But of course, the biggest challenge with any kind of change to the federal program will be political. As we saw, some states will win and some states will lose in terms of the money that they get. And some states by a lot.
If you keep the dollar amount frozen, so it's a zero-sum contest.
Right. And
as
so,
the scenarios do.
And so all of the scenarios, right, as Jeff said, they keep at $41 billion. And so the last point on this slide is that if we're going to change any of the new funding or any of the formula factors, we will need new funding. We need a substantial amount of funding so that perhaps nobody loses and some people or some states win out more than other states, but in effect, there would be no big net losers when it comes to the ultimate distribution. It's a potential prospect, particularly given the interest in infrastructure funding in both the Democrat and Republican caucuses, as well as in the Congress and the White House. So there may be an ability for this, but we'll be part of that. So Jeff, is there any other kind of concluding thoughts and question or things you want to add before we jump to questions?
Just that this whole enterprise is meant to be a starting point for conversations, because I want everyone to understand just how irrational the current system has become. I mean, there's no legitimate policy-based explanation for continuing to give out CMAQ money based on 2007 air attainment in city by city, or give out funding based on relative shares of VMT in 2007. And Bill Thomas retired from Congress in 2006, and continuing to give California extra money every year just because he managed to get $750 million in earmarks for Bakersfield in 2005. Also, it's very hard to find any kind of legitimate policy-based rationale for that. So while we realize that the politics of this are very difficult, the current system by which we're going to be distributing this money largely through 2025 under the Senate bill is so irrational that perhaps we need to do some fundamental rethinks of how we're distributing this funding.
So thanks, everybody. It is 4:30 now. We are going to continue for the next 15 or 20 minutes to ask or answer some questions. Those of you that do have questions, and we see a bunch coming through, please use the question function on your GoToChat webinar. Karen Price, who is in the room with us, is going to be reading off a couple of those questions for Jeff and I to answer. We're going to hope to get through as many as we can in the next 15 or 20 minutes, but we hope to continue the conversation.
So first question, are the Highway Trust Fund levels going to force Congress to act? And related to that, which scenario would be the most politically viable?
If Highway Trust Fund shortages hadn't forced Congress to act yet, we'll see. The trust fund's good till summer 2021. The amount of money that's going to be required, averaging $15 billion a year forever, just to keep things current at baseline level, that's a significant amount of money to try to find from general revenues. But they stunned me with the amount of money they were able to find in the FAST Act. So I'm not at all sure that this will force the fundamental rethink that's so desperately needed. What was the second part of the question?
Is there a scenario, one of these scenarios, or a scenario that is most politically viable?
So in terms of the most politically viable, I mean, the challenge, as we mentioned, is that none of these, as written, are that politically viable because there are too many states that end up losing a lot of money based on the current factors. So I don't think that there's any scenario that we would say is politically viable or the best. And I think that this is, again, intended to start tweaking. But I think a blend of both needs-based factors to recognize the fact that states have different needs and need to maintain and operate their systems, and then performance-based factors to help reward states that are doing a good job and are meeting their goals, I think is the kind of program that we'd like to see.
In 1998, the T21 law they increased highway funding so much they were able to make some difficult funding choices, and states that lost money in terms of their percentage of the total still got so much more in terms of actual dollars that they didn't care so much about their percentage. In SAFETEA in 2005, there wasn't as much new money to be able to be added to the system. So what essentially happened there was when the bill was on the Senate floor, I think in 2004, Bill Frist was the majority leader. He just kept throwing different formula shares up against the wall over and over until they found one that could get 30 states, meaning 60 senators, to vote to move the bill forward. Unless you can get a significant amount of money, if you could increase current spending from the $42 billion we had in 2018 to 50 some, you could do a lot. Several of these scenarios would be potentially very viable, just because then you would be able to take away people's percentage of the total while still giving them more dollars and hopefully assuage them a little bit.
So the CMAQ program was mentioned several times in the context of congestion, but that program's primary eligibility criterion is emissions benefits. Did you vary the CMAQ apportionment by number of non-attainment areas today compared to pre-2007 levels or to project types funded?
I mentioned congestion because that's the name of the program. It's congestion mitigation and air quality. And no, we didn't use any updated. And I should mention that the original CMAQ program was the factor was 100% based on the weighted population of a non-attainment area, and the weighting was done with a variety of different. Particulate matter had one weighting, and I was on another weighting. And unfortunately, the government no longer collects those statistics since we stopped basing highway funding on. I asked FHWA, and they said we don't collect that data anymore. I believe we did, for one of the alternative scenarios, use a different method. What was that, Paul?
Well, so the most recent data we have on non-attainment areas is from 2009, and those are the numbers we're using for the scenarios that use non-attainment areas.
Yeah. So again, it's unfortunate that data is no longer collected as a part of the larger data loss that Paul mentioned at the end of the presentation.
But we do have a couple of formula factors that might be actually better than that. We used some carbon dioxide emissions, fuel used on highways, fuel consumed per GDP. There's some really interesting metrics that go beyond the non-attainment areas that I think might be more effective to the national goals in terms of environmental programs.
So what is an optimized scenario, i.e. one where the funding distribution minimizes states' loss and gains?
Yeah, so we we did play around with a little bit of trying to figure out how do we get to an outcome where states, losses and gains are minimized. But then we found ourselves trying to work at it in a kind of a backwards way, because the goal of the program isn't to minimize losses and gains to states. It's trying to drive what are the outcomes that we're trying to get. How do we make sure that states have their basic needs covered, but they're also incentivized to have a better program? Obviously, there is the political discussion that goes into that, and we weren't able to find a series of metrics that basically reproduced what we have today without changing a whole lot. I mean, I don't think that's possible. But we also thought that was kind of the wrong look at it. We should be looking at how do we get the program that we want.
So related to that, which scenario would aid state DOTs the most in terms of maintaining the existing highway system?
So, I mean, in terms of that, right now the current distribution is for capital programs. We talked a little bit in our last scenario 8, where we created a program that was focused on maintenance. And so if a state is interested in maintenance, there isn't a federal highway program that's focused just on maintenance and preservation. And so this was a recommendation that came out of the TRB Future Interstate report from a few months ago. Something that we've been interested in is creating a program at the federal level that's focused on the maintenance piece for bridges, highways, and other infrastructure assets.
So this one is, we in Texas don't like any of these options. Should we always be sending our motor fuels tax dollars to the rural parts of the country?
That's an interesting question. Again, it's great that everyone in Texas drives a big SUV and drives 90 miles an hour with the air conditioning on max, and that there's so much, in particular, Texas's rate of return is driven as much by the heavy naphtha truck traffic down there, and FHWA that leaves diesel fuel, and then FHWA models the truck sales tax and highway truck use tax and the tire tax entirely on the same percentage as diesel. So you're a sort of grand conjunction of things happening there. But, and this is just me speaking personally, looking at the way this program has evolved, especially since 1956, I think that the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 and the construction of the interstate was a fundamentally different social compact between the states and the federal government than the rest of the program. That's why I had a 90% federal share. Everything else was 50-50 at the time. I personally think that any state equity considerations should not involve interstate funding, because the interstate system was built on the cost to complete the roads on that map that the 48 states agreed to in 1947, that was funded in 1956, and it was inherent from the get-go that some states would subsidize others, because there's no way Montana could fund building I-90 on their own. Some states were going to have to subsidize others to get the national system. So I think if you could have, get certain amounts of national focus that involve the clear national goal and cross-subsidization, and don't apply any kind of equity adjustments to those. I think interstates were about 36.5% of formula money was spent on interstate roads, on the interstate system in terms of obligations at FY17. Back that out of the system entirely. There's no rate of return should not apply to the interstate program, and then segregate that, and then have whatever equity adjustments you're gonna want apply to the rest of the money.
And I will say, from Texas' standpoint, the only scenario where they were able to win money is scenario 2, which is applying the safety lieu formula back on top of what's here originally. So using the safety lieu formulas seemed to help out Texas and California, but some of the big states that lost again were Pennsylvania, Illinois, New York. I will also say that the paradigm may be shifting, and the next highway reauthorization may be one that's a little bit different. We increasingly are using general funds, and I know that Texas is the only state that's a quote unquote donor state at this time. But
they're the only one that have gone to 95%. There's some other couple maybe between 95 and 100.
Yes, that's right. But if we look at other countries, and this was a released a report a few years ago called "The Life and Death of the Highway Trust Fund," Other democracies like with economies like ours, like Australia, Canada, the UK, Germany, France, they all have higher fuel taxes than we do in this country, but they do not dedicate the fuel taxes at the national level to transportation improvements. They kind of view the fuel tax as a carbon tax, more or less. It's decoupled from transportation. It goes into their general funds, and then their national governments fund transportation out of the general fund like any other program. And the interesting thing is that they tend to have better transportation outcomes. We usually look at with envy at the transportation systems and infrastructure of our other countries. And so part of this might be thinking about changing the funding mix at the federal level and perhaps infusing more general funds as a way to increase infrastructure overall and move away from some of the donor-donee fights.
So any idea how much extra money would be needed to implement various scenarios while holding all states relatively harmless?
I don't think we ever specifically plug that in, but it would be a bunch, depending on in several of those scenarios in particular.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the scenario. We did try to cap the different losses and gains that states had. So for many of them, that was like a 10% or 15% loss cap, which would mean that they would need to increase funding by 10 or 15% to make those states, at a baseline zero change. But again, that would be subject to change every year because how formulas work is that they update them every year and it's a dynamic.
They should. They haven't been since 2009, but they should.
Exactly.
In developing those scenarios, was there any consideration of directing more funds to metropolitan areas? A report this week, for example, shows that our metro areas continue to expand share of U.S. economic output, which is already disproportionately high.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge consideration, but we also tried to balance that out with the needs of what we would have in in the Senate, right, where it's dominated by rural states, and that's an important political consideration. But in the scenario 8, we did create a discretionary grant program targeted towards metropolitan accessibility, again focused on those kind of projects that could really improve accessibility at the metropolitan level.
This is a very old argument. Go back to the Nixon administration's proposal for a single urban fund in 1970, I think, for combining mass transit and urban highway funding in one lump sum to be given to the metro area to use as they wish, things like that. I believe the commission, I forget which one it was, what Mary Peters chaired in 2008, also recommended the establishment of a separate metropolitan mobility program. So it's a very old argument, and there are definitely some legitimate issues about metro areas, but that winds up begging the question of whether it's appropriate to direct highway funding, particularly at urban areas with the requirement they use it on highways. So unless you want to get into the broader issue of flexing money back and forth between highways and transit, which this report specifically avoided, it's hard to design a metro program.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Jeff. And something that we didn't do, and we made it in the paper, is that this is focused on highways because we had to bound the report in some respect. But I think we can make an argument, and perhaps it should be part of this conversation, is should we be thinking about transportation not in modal silos, but in more issue areas, whether that's safety or environment or metropolitan accessibility, what have you, in ways that then let the states meet goals no matter what mode they might want to choose to invest in.
Particularly in the Highway Trust Fund bankruptcy era, because when you're borrowing billions of dollars from China or stealing it from the Federal Reserve and putting it in the trust fund, highways isn't entitled to 80% of that money any more than NASA or HUD are. So there's definitely no legitimate modal entitlement or donor-donee state entitlement to this general fund money that's been transferred in.
I'm going to ask two questions. I said one, but two questions because there's an interesting. So first, there's been a lot of questions about earmarks. Would bringing back earmarks grease the skids enough to get something like this implemented in the absence of significant new funding? Of course, that would mean there's an inherently non-performance-based set aside for earmarks.
traditionally it's been the opinion that having earmarks would allow, but makes it easier to get the votes to pass controversial legislation, and I'm sure that's still the case. Although earmarks aren't coming back until all four corners of Congress, House Republicans, House Democrats, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, agree to hold hands and jump off the bridge at the same time and bring them back. And so far, House Republicans have been unwilling to do that, and no one else has been willing to. The rest of them haven't been willing to pull the trigger and earmark money on their own. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Just real quick, somebody asked us to clarify what a donor state means.
This term emerged in the 1980s of states that were contributing more money in taxes to the Highway Trust Fund than they were receiving in apportioned funding. It used to be measured as a percentage share. If your state paid, 2% of the trust fund taxes and were only getting 1.8% of the money, you would think of yourself as a donor state. And donee states, which, by the way, Microsoft doesn't recognize that as a word, so it was corrected to done instead of donee a couple of times in the presentation by autocorrect. Donor states are on the opposite side. They receive more highway funding than they pay in user taxes. And it used to be measured as a percentage share in versus percentage share out, but since the Highway Trust Fund went bankrupt, there are no real donor states anymore. Maura Downey once said the only donor state is the People's Republic of China. So now, since 2012, it's been measured in 90% of your dollars in versus dollars out. And Texas has been the only state that has been able to trigger that in terms of dollars in, dollars out since 2012.
So, last question. Given that none of these scenarios seem very favorable for highly populated areas, do you think it's possible that some states will want to entertain the idea of eliminating the national program?
I'm sure some might want to, although the states that want to eliminate the national program tend to be the ones that are currently donor states, the ones that are currently donee states and getting, more money than they put in, have a bigger advantage in perpetuating the status quo. But, if you ask yourself if there's a rational basis for continuing a program based on real world data that hasn't been updated since 2007 and earmarks based on who was politically powerful in 2005 and continuing that until the year 2025, I don't see a rational basis for that. And if you're going to say, should Congress continue programs without a rational basis just for political inertia, I'm not sure the answer is objectively yes.
And I would say, so for folks on the phone, again, you can download the data sheet that we used. It's it's like 15-tab Excel spreadsheet. It's quasi-complicated, but it kind of walks through each scenario that we did and all the factors. I would encourage you to try testing out a couple different formulas that might redirect money to different parts of the country or different types of transportation. There's lots of different ways to slice this. This was 8 of infinity. So we would encourage folks to kind of use this as a launching board to start the conversation. Send us your most compelling scenarios, see what you can come up with. And of course, you can tweet at us. Our Twitter handles for me and Jeff are both on the screen here. Continue to send us emails, questions, thoughts, concerns. We want to continue to answer questions. I know we haven't gotten to all of them on the phone. But again, this is supposed to start this conversation, and we look forward to continuing it. Thanks, everybody, for calling in.
Thank you very much.